Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to be working through an IGCSE Extended Mathematics Paper 2 style question involving the well-known values of sine, cosine, and tan that we see in the upper right hand corner here, as well as the unit circle. So let's get started. We're told x is an acute angle and cosine of x is equal to 1/2. We're then told find the value of, first of all, sine of x, and secondly, we'll have to find the value of cosine of 180 plus x. Okay, well of course we'll start with question 1, and I'll write a little 1 down here. And so again, we need to find the value of sine of x. Well, let's see. Since we're told that x is an acute angle, and we're told that cosine of x is equal to 1/2, we can use our table of well-known values here to quickly see that cosine is equal to 1/2 for an acute angle of 60 degrees. And that tells us that the angle x that we're working with here is 60 degrees. Consequently, sine of x that we're trying to find is no more than sine of 60. And provided we know this table of values off by heart, which we should, we'll have no trouble in stating that sine of 60 degrees is equal to the square root of 3 over 2. Indeed, that's this value right here in our table. And so we can go ahead and state the answer that sine of x, in other words, sine of 60, is equal to the square root of 3 over 2. There we go. And in fact, I'll go ahead and box my answer, like so. Okay, I move on to question 2. Now in question 2, we need to find cosine of 180 plus x, which I'll add here is the same thing as cosine of x plus 180. And to find the value of cosine of x plus 180, or 180 plus x, we can make use of our knowledge of the unit circle. And so let me do that here. I'll attempt to draw a decent circle, something looking like that. There we go. And so that's centered at the origin, like so. And I'll label the center here. I'll call the center O. And remember, the unit circle crosses the axes at 1, 1 at the top here, -1, and -1. Okay, now to figure out what cosine of x plus 180 is, the first thing I'll do is place a point along the circumference of my circle whose radius makes an angle of x, so in this case 60 degrees, with the positive horizontal axis. So let me do that here. I'll place a point P roughly there along the circumference, so I'll call my point P. And so the radius OP that I'm drawing right here makes an angle 60 degrees with the positive horizontal axis. So that's 60 degrees right there. And remember here, this point P along the circumference of this unit circle is such that because the angle that's made here is 60 degrees, its coordinates will be cosine of 60 degrees, or cosine of 60, and sine of 60 degrees. And something similar to this would be written regardless of the angle that the radius OP makes with the positive horizontal axis. So if my point P were up here in such a way that OP made an angle of 120 degrees, then the point P would have coordinates cosine of 120 and sine of 120. But here we're interested in cosine of x plus 180. And so let me start by saying that since we're interested in the value of cosine, we'll effectively need to find the horizontal coordinate of a point. So let me just write that underneath here. We need to find a horizontal coordinate. Horizontal coordinate. Now you may have noticed I keep on saying horizontal coordinate instead of x coordinate. And that's simply because in this question, the angle that's made here is what's being referred to as x. So I'm forcing myself to use the term horizontal coordinate instead of x coordinate to avoid any confusion. That being said, I carry on. Since the x we have here we know is 60 degrees, the point we'll consider along the circumference of this unit circle will be the point we'd reach if we left this point P and carried on an extra 180 degrees around the unit circle, which hopefully you can appreciate would be the point diametrically opposite point P. And so I'll go ahead and place that point here, and I'll call that point Q. And so this angle here would be 180 degrees. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, the total angle that I'm drawing right now in blue would be 60 plus 180, which is 240 degrees. Now, by definition, this point Q has coordinates cosine of 240 and sine of 240. And so now we know that the cosine x plus 180 that we're after is cosine of 240. So that's the horizontal coordinate of this point Q. But now, since the point P we had was at a 60-degree angle from the positive horizontal axis, indeed that was 60 degrees, hopefully you'll agree that by symmetry here, the point Q we have will be at 60 degrees from the negative horizontal axis. And despite the fact that this sketch is far from being perfect, hopefully you can appreciate that the horizontal coordinate of this point Q, so that would be this value right here, is the opposite of the horizontal coordinate of point P, which would be this value right here. And since the horizontal coordinate of point P was cosine of 60, which remember was 1/2, the horizontal coordinate of this point Q, which is equal to cosine of 240, will be negative 1/2. And that's all there is to it. Indeed, we can now state that cosine of x plus 180 is equal to cosine of 240, since x was 60 degrees, and that's equal to the opposite of cosine of 60, and so I'll go ahead and write that. That's equal to the opposite of cosine of 60. In other words, that's equal to negative, or the opposite of, 1/2. And that's the final answer. And I'll go ahead and box that result. There we go. And it's worth pointing out that as soon as we have a point that's diametrically opposite to a point in the first quadrant, its coordinates will be the exact opposites of its corresponding coordinates in the first quadrant. And so, although we weren't asked, we could even state that sine of 240 is equal to the opposite of sine of 60, which would have been negative square root of 3/2. And a similar result will be found regardless of where we place point P in the first quadrant, when we consider the point that's diametrically opposite to it. So in the third quadrant, their coordinates will be the exact opposites of each other. And there we go. That's how we can answer this IGCSE Extended Mathematics Paper 2 style question involving the well-known values of sine, cosine, and tan, and the unit circle. All that being said and done, that's it for this tutorial.